Three.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I am going to be talking to you about complexes. The alternate title to this talk, I gave this talk at NORWAC, and so I like to kind of represent and retool the information so I have it on this kind of recording and I can deliver the material kind of fresh. But the alternate title to this is Complexes Are Complex, because they are. And I think that as astrologers, it's important for us, especially evolutionary astrologers, where we're more concerned with the psyche of the person on a soul and current life level, that it's important for us to understand the dynamics of complexes and how they are affecting ourselves as well as our clients. So I'm going to switch to screen share. And so either you run your complexes or your complexes run you. So what is a complex? Clearly I'm talking about psychological, and we can go from either present life to past life, and they're actually they both have the same dynamics. It's just that one is buried deeper in the subconscious. So our karmic complexes, of which I wrote a whole book about, and I'm not going to be getting into, our karmic complexes certainly are buried much deeper behind our current life complexes, and quite frequently they inform our current life complexes, or one might say that the causative factor of a complex in our psyche did not originate in this lifetime. So it's another way of saying that. So what is a complex? So the definition of a complex is a core pattern of emotions, memories, perceptions, impulses, wishes in the personal unconscious constellated around a common theme. So when Jung talked about complexes, that's Carl Gustav Jung, talked about complexes, he said that they're feeling toned. And what he meant by that is that they have affect. And affect in psychological language means they have a very strong charge. They have a very strong emotional component to them, which generally, especially in the term of complexes, is a negative affect. So here, you can see on this slide that these are the kind of thoughts that are associated with some of the negative feelings which might be constellating the complex, like not being talented enough, not being smart enough, not being good enough, not being pretty enough. And then all these kinds of complexes and very charged emotions can be within these kinds of thoughts. So the thought is kind of the surface of the complex. The core of the complex, though, as Jung was saying, is that it's feeling tones. There's a very strong negative charge. So Jung also talked about complexes as having an archetypal element. And in his day, there were certain archetypes that were defined. I'll mention a few of them, or certain complex archetypes that were defined that has certainly been expanded in more modern day. But first, let's understand what an archetype is. So an archetype is, one description of it is that it's a watercourse of collective experience that forms a furrow, like a riverbed. So if you think of collective experience, and it's like water flowing, and it flows in one direction long enough, it creates a groove or a riverbed, and then the water continues to flow there. So for example, what are common human experiences that we can say are archetypal experiences? Well, one of the most primordial ones is being a mother or being a father. So those are archetypes, right? And we can go from, divine mother to our personal mother. Actually, that's where complexes get formed. So, for example, speaking of the mother complex, it's informed by the collective. So every person who's ever been a mother contributes to this archetype in some way, in the archetypal realm. And then there's our personal experiences. So as I said, a complex can form around mothering in a lot of ways, certainly in past lives, and get carried over into the current life. but just the idea that we come in already with these kind of, because it's on an archetypal level, we come in already with these, what's the word I want to say? Not expectant desires, but a child's, you know, an innocent, somebody's feedbacking. There's an echo on here. Just if somebody's not muted, I'm just mentioning it. Where was I? Child comes in with these needs that are, you know, need to be nurtured, need to be cared for, need to be protected, need to be cared for by the mother. And you know, then we have this kind of, the highest form of that archetype we would say would be like the divine mother, you know, where she's all giving, she's all encompassing, she's all caring and nurturing. And then we have our personal experience of mother, which usually falls short. And then a complex forms. So some of the complexes we might be familiar with are like some of the ones that I mentioned here, although they're not named. You can name each one of these a particular complex, but some of the ones, more common ones that you've heard of, are like a persecution complex or a Napoleon complex, or the father-mother complex actually had another term called the Oedipus or the Electra complex. An inferiority complex, a superiority complex, the martyr, the savior, the hero, a God complex, a Don Juan complex, Peter Pan, the puer, right? Doesn't want to grow up, the eternal youth. So astrologically, what's interesting is that because we deal with archetypes, that we can start to think in an archetypal sense, using either the planets or the zodiac signs, and think of the kinds of complexes that might be associated with them. So, you know, just for example, you can think of, now, I'm talking in archetypal sense. It's difficult to discern complexes by looking at the chart. Like, you're not going to look at it and say, oh, this person has a God complex. I mean, I wrote a book about karmic complexes. Those you can kind of discern because we're looking at, you know, certain symbols within the chart, Pluto and the nodes. But even then, they're not so straightforward. I mean, within the Aries archetype and within every archetype, I'm just using Aries for an example, there's a broad spectrum of meaning. So you can go from the highest of the high to the lowest of the low within that archetype. And in my Karmic Complexes book, that's what I was writing about, these different potential manifestations of karmic complexes that can arise within each zodiacal archetype. But, you know, we can start to think in this way, and the more that you think in this way, then you can actually start to see some kind of patterns or potentialities, and that also includes, you know, listening to your client and what they're talking about, and, you know, you could be looking at the chart going, oh, aha, that makes perfect sense. So, you know, part of my objective with this talk is to get you to kind of develop what some transpersonal psychologists have called the archetypal eye. And I think as astrologers, we all have that, because I think that once you learn astrological archetypes, it's like you can't not think in archetypes, right? I know it was true for me. It's like I can't not think in astrological archetypes. And part of that is because archetypes are organizing principles, right? I mean, the planets themselves are organizing principles, as are the signs. So, for example, you know, something like a poverty complex, you might start to already think, oh, what archetypes might that belong to? That, you know, certainly has a Venusian component to it, so it can kind of flow to the Taurus, the inner side of Venus to Taurus. You know, a guilt complex, in EA that's always been clearly associated with Capricorn and Virgo. It's not that the other signs aren't guilty, but again, we're talking archetypal. Interesting, just, you know, and again, when you start talking about archetypes, they show up everywhere. So I was putting together some things for this PowerPoint, and then before showing up here, and I went to go take my dog for a walk, and I was down in the park, and this guy walked up to me, young kid, who was either totally tripped out on something, or sadly, he was schizophrenic. But he started spewing complexes one after the other, like within 2 minutes. The conversation started something like, it's all about people working too hard, and why are people working so hard? And then Trump has these helicopters and he's after me, and my mother worked for the FBI, and they're trying to kill her, and I know all this stuff. So he literally went from and then he went into something about being from some other sphere and that he's trying to help humanity. And right there, he went from a paranoia complex to a God complex. And maybe I'll use him later to explain something more about the dynamics of complexes, but I'm just bringing it up. But for example, like a paranoia complex, we can start to maybe associate that with Mars, Aries, or Pluto, Scorpio. So just, to start to develop your thinking in that way. So now, and I'm going to stop every once in a while and just see if anybody has questions, because I'm really open to dialogue. So I'll just stop for a second. Nope. Okay. So how does a complex form? So Jung said that a complex forms where we experience a defeat in life. So I like this slide because it's very much about this kind of expression of Mars libidinal energy. And some people have mistaken libido as having a sexual connotation. It does, but that's not the pure meaning of libido. Libidinal energy is pure life force energy. It's our Mars, it's our will. So when you hear me use that word, keep that in mind. So we have this will, we have a will, and will has desires, and we want to accomplish things and do things and, not just be blobs. And if we didn't have will, what would we be doing, right? So everything that we're doing is informed by our will. And our will, wants to, like I said, complete something, bring something into manifestation, do something, right? Now, when our will is engaged and doing something and it meets something that stops it, be it either in a really traumatic sense or even just an inability to complete something, the potentiality, and this is what Jung was talking about, the potentiality for a complex to form happens right there. Now, complexes have when you have constellated a complex in the subconscious, it has within its core a traumatic event. So, just because you get stopped from whatever it is, you're going shopping and you forgot to bring your money and you can't buy your bread, that's not going to form a complex, right? But, if you don't have enough money to buy the bread, that might be a complex. So it's again, this forward moving energy, think of it like this, forward moving energy becomes thwarted, and the Mars impulse within us, the will, is then goes into protection mode, or goes into overdrive, for example. This is why adrenaline is associated with Mars. Adrenaline helps us to protect ourselves. Mars has a protective component to it. Adrenaline flushes into our system to be able to help us either fight or flight, right? That's what you want to do when you're threatened. You either want to stop the threat by crushing it or you want to run away from it. So it's a self-protective function. And when our will cannot fight or flight, and this is trauma, basic trauma theory, when the will cannot fight or flight, it freezes. And in the second that it freezes is exactly when the complex forms. And it's also exactly the moment when PTSD forms. Because all of the impulses in that moment that were either you wanted to fight or you flight, you couldn't, so you freeze. All of those impulses that are highly adrenalized in that moment get repressed, and then there's a whole other thing, I'll get into it a little bit later, where parts of us then maybe not only get repressed, but then we dissociate. And that in itself is a diagram or a kind of dynamic of how PTSD forms, post-traumatic stress. it also is how a complex forms. So let me just give you an astrological example. But before I do that, any questions?
Yes, I've got a question. What's the best relationship to have with a complex if you are totally aware of it after it has formed? You know you've got it. How do you relate to it?
Okay, well, I'm going to get into that a little bit later, because that has to do with this, that has to do with the idea, like Jung said. One of his quotes is something like, I'm paraphrasing, nowadays everybody knows we have complexes, but what we don't know is that complexes have us.
Okay, thank you.
Right. And so, but the point is that that's what my lecture, either you run your complexes or your complexes run you. So I am going to talk a little bit later about what does it mean to run a complex rather than be run by the complex, which I think relates to what you're asking. Okay. So this is a client that I worked with in regression, both present and past life. And speaking of Mars, which is why I liked her example, because just as a quick overview from the EA paradigm, we look at Pluto, we look at the nodes, we look at the planets with the nodes. What's also interesting, it's kind of similar to my chart in that I'm a December 62. So, there's some differences, but some similarities as well, certainly on the slower moving planets. So I can relate. There's things about her I can relate. So she came to me wanting to work on, and Linda, this might answer some of your questions. She wanted to work on a complex which we kind of named as a rejection complex. So again, just delineating the chart a little, keeping in mind Pluto's in the 7th house, but it's in Virgo. So there might be some, guilt, humiliation stuff there. The nodes are on the 6-12th axis. Mars and Saturn are involved, and the Sun and Neptune square the nodes from the 9th house in Scorpio. So some of these archetypes show up in what I'm talking about, not all of them, but a large part of them. So she wanted to work on this rejection complex. She had formed a complex around it related to relating. And what she was doing, she was aware of, was that she kind of had shut people out, even though she wanted relationships, but she was, then rejecting people before they would reject her. And that is a defense, right? So she recognized she had this defense. So she wanted to work on it. So we went into some present life stuff first, because your complexes from past lives will replay in your current life. That's the unfortunate nature of trauma, is that it doesn't just go away. So if a complex has been formed in a past life, it will continue to repeat through your incarnational cycles until you can bring it to some resolution. I mean, this is exactly what we do in EA, right, is try to discern these pre-existing kind of wounds to the soul, these samskaras that we come in with, so that we can understand more about the human psyche. And many times the things that are happening in the current life are simple replays of past lives or complexes that have formed in the past. But that doesn't make the current life incident of them, the replay of them, any less traumatic. It kind of just reinforces the complex. So to me, it's important to kind of root them out on both levels, kind of work with them from the past life perspective as well as the current life. So back to our rejection complex. So we started exploring by the affect of what it was. And, it was a kind of feeling into the defense, and then what was underneath the defense. And then she immediately went into a present life memory. And it was when she was in 2nd grade. And she was a little girl in 2nd grade. I don't know how old you are then, 6, 7, I mean, pretty young. And she had this crush on this really popular boy. And I mean, this is all Leo territory, right? Wait, where's my mouse? It's all kind of Leo, affairs of the heart, just this. So she had all this like drive, she's very Mars kind. And she chased him. She ran after him on the schoolyard, and because she wanted to kiss him. And she like really pursued him. Again, think Mars. And think of that slide I showed you before. And so she's chasing him and she wants to kiss him, and he runs away and he screams at her to leave him alone. And then all the kids notice and they stop and they start laughing at her. And then it kind of went on for weeks in school where they continued to tease her and call her names. And so again, thinking of that image that I had in the beginning, you know, her chart and her story is really an illustration of that. Here she is, just expressing her pure childlike, you know, in this case, it was erotic, libidinal energy, right? I mean, Mars and Leo, she's going for what she wants, right? And in the ninth house, you know, enthusiastic expression of oneself, and she meets this wall of shame, or shaming. And what's even worse is, I mean, the shaming was really bad because it was Catholic school. So, I mean, and this is back in the 60s, or, you know, so, you know, how unacceptable is it for a girl to be chasing a boy, right, in Catholic school? Very taboo. So she was, as sixth house, right, and Virgo, very humiliated. And then the theme, so it's kind of like we would say right there, even if there wasn't a past life component to it, we would say right there, you know, the complex formed, right? And I'm going to get into a little bit more of describing the defenses and things. But so the defense then forms to keep her from the pain of that rejection, from the pain of that humiliation. And her defense, as I said, you know, became instead of, and this is a natural function of the psyche. I mean, who wants to walk around feeling that shamed and that humiliated all the time? So the defense then became a kind of, you know, it's a wound of the expression of her heart, but it became this kind of, if they don't want me, I don't want them, and I'm going to reject them before. But it doesn't get rid of the original impulse. So the original impulse, as we can see here, I mean, she is a Pluto in the seventh, right? So there is some impulse around relating. And that, you know, it has its polarity point, meaning that there's things that she needs to learn about that. But so there's a desire for connection that doesn't go away, yet now it becomes tainted, right? And this is the idea of a complex. Yeah, I mean, the suppression of the emotion, I'm just thinking of being critical, again, sixth house, Virgo, and rejecting before she was rejected. And in short, there's a past life behind that we also went into in another session. And she had a lot of past lives, again, relating to this Aquarius and the Saturn conjunct in the 12th, of being outcast, of being alienated, of being singled out, those kinds of lives. But one that kind of really mirrored, or we might say was the core karmic complex of what was repeated in the current life, was a life where she was, you know, again, this is very archetypal, 6th, 12th house. As you know, Virgo Pisces is often associated with Christianity. She has it here too. So she was, guess what, a nun, right, in a past life, who had an illicit affair, and she got outed, and she was betrayed. Oops, something happened there. Betrayed, Scorpio. And then she was shamed and humiliated, and then outcast and punished for that Saturn punishment kind of energy. So you can see, you know, the complex formed in the past life replays in the current life, and this is something that I see in my work a lot, that you know, well, we know trauma repeats itself, and quite frequently in past lives, when the complex formed, it was in a much more severe circumstance. It kind of gets less severe as time goes on, meaning that it's not always an exact replay. You know, she didn't get kicked out of the nunnery and live on the streets in poverty like she did in that lifetime. Yet the affect is the same. the impact on the psyche is the same. So even though the past life was extremely more traumatic than kids laughing at her in school, when those kids laughed at her in school, all of the past life affect as well as the current life affect rushes to the surface, which is why, and again, you'll see as I get on, that complexes can take over us, right? And why it's hard to not be run by complexes. Okay. Any other questions? So this is Freud's iceberg model of the human psyche. And I'm just referencing this just quickly. Jung talked about complexes, which I like his language. He actually said they're like nodes, N-O-D-E-S. He actually used that word, buried in the subconscious. And in his use of the word node, it's not like we use node, but it certainly is interesting. He means it like a knot that's hardened and it needs to be unknotted to heal, right? So the complex itself, or the core affect of the complex, has already been repressed, as just like I was giving in the example before. It's been repressed into the subconscious because, like I said, who wants to walk around feeling that miserable all the time? So it's unconscious where most of our trauma is. So as we know in Freud's iceberg model, and we have this in our language when we say that, it's only the tip of the iceberg, our conscious mind and what I call our daytime consciousness, which is, it's a cool analogy because daytime, it's like, the sun is out or it's light and you can see things and things make sense and you can navigate easily and all of those things you can do. And so daytime consciousness is very rational. It's what we usually associate our consciousness with. It's the thinking part of you. It's the you part listening to me right now, making connections, having thoughts, all of taking notes, whatever you're doing. Having a snack, I don't know what you're doing. So the conscious daytime consciousness, and quite frequently we identify ourselves as just this limited little tip of the iceberg, like we are this. And we do that because, as you know, in EA, and Jeffrey has said it many times, the ego values consistency. Right? So the ego consciousness kind of wants to be rational. It wants to be consistent. So our conscious mind very much values this and puts a lot of energy into just focusing our awareness here. But we have these other levels. So here, in between the subconscious and the conscious, is the preconscious. And the preconscious you can think of like waves on the shore, right? If you also use the ocean and the shoreline, and the deep sea also as analogies for this. It's like the waves on the shore. So, the ocean comes up on the shore and it laps on the shore and then it recedes. So the preconscious is kind of like this membrane, the place where the conscious and the subconscious meet. And generally in the preconscious mind, these are accessible memories, but they're just not on your mind right now. Now, the thing about the preconscious is that it can allow material from this, it's like, think membrane again, it can allow material from the subconscious to arise. It can also repress it, right? So it can draw the conscious mind into the deep sea, or the deep sea can penetrate the preconscious, the membrane, and flood the consciousness. And this is what happens when we are overcome by repressed subconscious material. And most of the time, repressed subconscious material is the content of a complex, right? Because again, complexes usually have at their core undesired, irrational. They're irrational to the conscious mind, fears and phobias and repressed traumas, painful emotions and all of that. And so when we've had those kinds of traumatic experiences, present or past life, they get they get relegated to the basement of your consciousness. And this subconscious is it's nighttime consciousness. It's highly irrational to the conscious mind. This is what shows up in your dream states, you know, where you're like walking up the stairs and then, you know, there's a chicken there and then whatever, you know. This is why transpersonal psychologists and Jung and Freud were so interested in dreams and images, because they looked at them as ways to understand the subconscious, as gateways kind of to penetrate through the preconscious into the subconscious. And this is part of how we work with our complexes. You have to get irrational. And you have to allow the irrational, which is kind of hard for the conscious mind. And so another thing that Jung talked about was that complexes, and this is a very important point, complexes are wholly or partly split off from consciousness, meaning, I mean, he defines that some complexes you can be partially conscious of, some of them you're completely unconscious of. Again, those are usually the ones that other people see in you that you don't see in yourself, or that you've repressed so deeply that they never come out, they never see the light of day, but they do come out when something is triggered, and then they flood the consciousness. But what Jung was talking about is saying that when they are repressed in the subconscious, they are autonomous. They have a life of their own. Because they are split off from the conscious awareness. So most complexes, and this was one thing that he found so fascinating about complexes, is that they're like living entities within you. Right? It's like they're having their own secret lives. And we only become aware of them when the conscious mind is penetrated quite frequently by stress or by a trigger of a like event. Right? In my work, we call that being triggered. And then the subconscious content can flood the consciousness. And we have language about that, right? Where we say, oh, something came over me, or I wasn't myself, or, you know, things like that. And then we quickly repress it again, as much as you can, right? Because they often, what also comes roaring forward into the consciousness are the intense feelings, the affect that I was talking about. All those painful emotions that were repressed are what penetrates the conscious mind. So one way to think of complexes then, and I've certainly done it in my work in karmic complexes, because I think of our past life selves as inner characters living within us, having their own lives, you know, and the parts that they're unfinished with are the parts that we are left to finish, i.e. that's what we call karma. But you can also think of complexes as like these kind of autonomous inner characters living within you, and in some forms of, you know, transpersonal or experiential psychology like Gestalt or psychodrama. These are all the forms of therapy that I love, because they give those voices an identity, right? So you can have your inner critic and have a dialogue with your inner critic, or you can have your inner judge, or you can have your inner nun meet your inner prostitute, right? These are all, and so giving them or allowing them to reveal an identity is also a way to, back to Linda's question about identifying complexes, but also learning more about them, more than learning about them, letting their reality kind of penetrate the conscious mind so that you can work with the content. This is what Jung was talking about when he was saying these nodes buried in the subconscious that are like hardened, they're like knots that need to be unknotted. So you slowly unravel these complexes. So again, the core of a complex, this is just a quick diagram. Let me just stop and see if anybody has a question there.
Just really quickly, so it's very important to let them come out and express rather than let them fester and be hidden, yeah?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, Jeffrey said that too. He always said that, you know, you can repress stuff, but the more you repress it and don't give it expression, the more distorted it becomes. And then when it does surface, it's usually quite distorted, you know. So yeah, we want to bring more of that daytime consciousness into the unconscious, or allow the irrational. And this is what's very hard to do, right? Because we like this self-consistency of our identities, but to allow the irrational, and you know, you all know it, you've met the irrational in yourself. It's where you have a fear or a phobia that's just totally out of context of the situation that you're in, you know. You know, and when you have something like that, the affect is so strong, it's hard to kind of ride through it, or to try to even go deeper into it, because that's actually the prescription, is that you want to find that kind of affect. Those are, in my work, I always say, when you hit the irrational is where the juice is, right? I only want the irrational. I don't want the rational thoughts. They're irrelevant to my kind of work. We want to go right into the irrational. So yeah, you have to allow yourself to do that. And again, it's not something that you can do on your own, because the other side of it is you can't work through your own defenses. So yeah, having a good guide or having some good therapeutic container is a way to explore your complexes.
What if the complex is about other people, like exposing yourself to other people, so you can't really get a guide? So kind of
you're going to have to find somebody to trust. No, it's true. I mean, as working with people therapeutically, there are certain complexes that are really hard to work with, because they come initially exactly with those kinds of things. Mistrust, right? People whose trust has been wounded repeatedly. It's hard for them to become vulnerable, but because I know I have to bring them into that vulnerable space. So we have to work layer by layer to get there. The other one that's really hard is people that have this is never going to work kind of complex. Like they continually get let down by people, or they continually, no matter what they've tried, it's never worked. You know, when those people walk in my door, you know, I often say to them, and what makes you think what's going to happen here is going to work, right? Because we have to address that first, right? It's a complex they're bringing in. I mean, this is one thing I've learned in my work that I think after 20, 30 years of working with the human psyche, and any of you who are doing counseling or doing astrology within that with clients, it's important to understand that many times you are talking to somebody's complex, and what I've learned is to love the person but not their complex. So that I don't get triggered by these negative aspects of people. I simply look at them with a kind of curiosity, right? Like, ooh, that's interesting. You're bringing that here. But I know that, and this is one of the part of the beauty of evolutionary astrology, is that we are trying to look beyond the ego, beyond the defenses, beyond the complexes, into the core of the soul, and to release that potentiality, because that is where the healing is, right? So keep that in mind. Love the person, but don't love their complex. You know, because you might have to wrestle with the complex a little. You might have to, you know, force it out into the open or something like that. So here's a diagram. I use this diagram to describe soul loss and soul fragmentation and dissociation. But since these things also, they may be, you know, I haven't really parsed it out enough, but it may be one and the same, right? Like a complex is also a form of dissociation, like exactly what Jung said. A part of the psyche splits off, and then once it's split off from the psyche, it has a life of its own, very much like shamanism would describe soul fragments. So in essence, this is a diagram of a complex. You know, I just kind of put it here because because as we know, as I was saying before, the core of a complex has, as Jung said, feeling tone, deep, charged, a negative emotion, right? So it's at this gut level. So again, here's just a quick diagram. So within the core of the complex, I have it over here, think of the example I gave you before of the woman. There's this healthy life force potentiality, right? Her erotic libidinal energy chasing the guy around chasing the kid around the schoolyard. That's let's say the original impulse, but then it was thwarted, right? So it becomes repressed. So everything that's connected with her desire to, have that kind of love from him or pursue him is then suppressed. So now we know a complex is formed. And that suppression, gets stuffed down, and there it is. And that's at the core of the complex. And then the next layer out are all the traumatic thoughts, feelings, and emotions that formed in that moment, right? So as I mentioned in her case, there was shame, there was humiliation. I don't remember the things that she told herself at the time, like, we can go back to some of those. I'm not good enough. I'm unlovable. I'm out of control. Whatever those thoughts are, the thoughts kind of cement the feelings and the emotions. And the strong emotion for her was shame, right? And then a shutdown of her very life force. And all of that has to happen. This is all the self-protective mechanism. There's no judgment in looking at this in people or in ourselves. This is the psyche's natural defenses, right? This is how it does it. This is a diagram of how the psyche does it. And then around that, the defenses form. So, defenses, these are some typical defenses: denial, numbing, and shutdown. That forms this kind of core, and that's what keeps the complex in place, right? So if you don't go through the defenses, you never get to this, and then you never get to this, and you never get that back, because this is what you really want back. That's at the core of the complex. So for her, in the case that I was giving you, what she needs to regain from herself, for herself, by working through the defense and going and following the thoughts into the feelings of shame to finish these unfinished impulses, which we did in our session. We got to do in the imaginal realm, where she got to yell at those kids that yelled at her and say, look, I just want, all of these things that were unfinished in her psyche that needed to be finished. That then released this back, which is just her healthy libidinal energy. And so that's just an example. So another way to know of a complex, or how do you know if you're in the grip of one or whatever, because lots of times complexes, like I said, from our, let me see if, it won't go back. Anyway, I can't go back to the previous slide. In the iceberg model, most of the time we're only mildly aware of our complexes in our conscious mind, because, we don't want to be those complexes. So, we're trying to distance ourselves from them. But one way that you can tell, you'll know when a complex takes you, because it has strong affect, like I said. But when you underdo something or you overdo something. So, somebody can be a mother and have a baby and get pregnant and have the baby and just kind of do the mother thing, right? And then it can totally trigger some other people. They may go into depression, or they may go into anxiety, or they may go into all of these different things that can arise. And that would be a kind of overdoing something, right? Or let's say, even taking back to the archetype of mother, somebody who, wants to have children or doesn't want to have children, somebody, either overdoing it or underdoing it. So that's just one way to kind of start to identify, can you easily just kind of flow into something and do it? Or is there some kind of, skip in the record there that then causes it to become more complex than it should be, right? Complexes are complex. And then we have, so this is just a picture of some defenses, right? So I like to use the analogy that defenses are like the moat around the castle. So, in the core of the castle, and in fact, in esoteric traditions and in magical traditions, there's always the inner sanctum. It's called the Holy of the Holies. And that's where the real stuff happens, right? That's where the treasure is. So the defenses are like this moat and this wall and the army and everybody else who's surrounding the castle trying to keep you out. But you've got to get there, because in the center is, again, that treasure that's waiting, that's been repressed, that, like I said, that healthy life force potential. But you have to first be able to get through the layer of the defenses, or even have the desire to get through the layer of the defenses. A lot of people don't. A lot of people identify themselves as their defenses, because that is, again, back to this picture of, we like to have this consistent picture of who we are, and who wants to be breaking out in hives over anxiety, or having rage fits, or whatever it is that, has been repressed, that's so undesirable to the conscious mind. So, they'll identify with the defense, and a lot of people are wholly identified with their defenses, especially when they're defenses like this, like compensation. Or sublimation, right? Somebody can wholly identify with that, and they think that that is who they are. But behind that is, as we know, it's keeping them away from some complex. So I'm not going to get into all of these. You can probably refer to it later. But just to give you an idea, and also from the astrological perspective, you can actually kind of, I haven't done it yet, but I keep threatening to make a list of, defenses and their kind of astrological correlations. But for example, you can already start to make thinking with your archetypal eye, right? Withdrawal, retreating, isolation, fantasy. Sounds pretty Pisces Neptunian, doesn't it? Denial is wholly Venusian Libran. Dissociation is, again, very Uranian Neptunian. Splitting and fragmentation is very Uranian, as well as splitting, psychological splitting is quite frequently associated with the Venusian Libran archetype. And so on and so on. Regression is very Saturnian. Repression is wholly Saturnian. So just to give you an idea, but these are all common defenses, and we all have them. Our psyche, our psyche uses them as natural functions, ways, because defenses are in place because they helped you get through something that was wholly traumatic, right? This is why I'm saying, you've got to kind of love your complexes and other people's complexes, right? And kind of have some compassion for what we've all been through as people, and how wounded we really are deep in the core there. And understand that these things are in place because they got people through some wounding. They got them through some kind of traumatic event. And then, but the difficulty with defenses are they stay in place long after the event passes. And that's what causes this dissociation. That's what causes the complex to be autonomous, because again, it's stuck back there in some time and some place that has long gone on. The woman who came to see me, she's 50 something, yet she still has within her some wounded 6-7-year-old second grader. That's kind of stuck in time and space, meaning she was split off from the psyche. Okay. Any questions?
I do have a question, Patricia.
Sure.
You suggest doing this with a guide. I mean, I personally have trust issues, so I'm not trying to derail from that. But as far as working with someone, do you suggest they be a regression-specific therapist? I mean, I know a couple EA folk that have been trained by you, but I don't know a lot of like regression therapists locally to me, and I know it's a lot of in-person, kind of like physically intense work from what I've heard, the little bit that I've heard. Are there other types of guides or therapists that could also help work through these defenses?
And any of the schools of experiential psychology are going to open up anything that uses imagination, right? But I mean this in the therapeutic sense. Like, so I would name some of the experiential schools: Gestalt, psychodrama, right? Like in Gestalt, for example, you know, in a Gestalt therapy session, you would become something, but you would do it, you know, you would become whatever the affect was that was arising. You know, in psychodrama, you would act it out. All of these things bypass the conscious mind. That's the key, right? Right. So that you kind of want to, you know, so yes, something that's somatic and something that's embodied in that sense, because complexes, our subconscious is wholly, almost wholly aligned with our soma, with our somatic, with our body. Most of our body is unconscious. Like, you know, you are very unconscious of your body right now, you know, all of the things that it's doing, right? So anything that's working not only in an embodied fashion, that's one way to do it. Somatic psychology can bypass the conscious mind to get right to the subconscious content. But any of these kind of imaginal therapies, you know, even using imagery, there's some forms of hypnotherapy that did it. I think the guy that has that school, the alchemal hypnotherapy, where, you know, you'll meet inner characters, they do conference room, right? You'll let, like I said before, meeting the inner critic, right? Having dialogues, those kinds of things. Those are ways to work through them. I mean, the regression therapy that I do and that I teach embodies and borrows from all of those different schools. So we have elements of Gestalt and of psychodrama and of shamanism and all of those things within my particular methodology. But any of them on their own, they're designed to do that, right? You know, Fritz Perls and Moreno, they were already there. They were the founders of those schools. They were already like, yeah, you know, this talk therapy stuff is baloney. Right. Right? You know, and that's the point. I mean, back to that diagram of the tip of the iceberg. That is what talk therapy does. It spins around the tip of the iceberg. Again, not dissing it. Right. But when you're talking about this kind of content, you're kind of circling the airport but never landing the plane.
Do you know, what do you think about EMDR? And I mean, if it's mostly talk therapy kind of person, but they do the little tapping or something somatic, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, EMDR is not about discharge. It's about discharging affect, but it's doing it a different way. I mean, I've experienced EMDR, and I think it's certainly useful in a lot of ways in, you know, in the context of, you know, working with the nervous system in trauma and PTSD. It's very effective. I don't know, it's not a processing therapy so much though. It's more like they kind of, you know, want to bypass it. It's just my personal bias.
Okay. Thank you.
That's I wouldn't dissuade you from it though. You know, because everybody.
I've done all that, but I haven't gotten through like the defenses, you know, like cleared some of these things. So.
Right. Well, so if you've done it, that, you know, you have your own experience. For some people, that it's the perfect thing for them, and I think that's fantastic. You know.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay.
Patricia?
Yes.
Hi, it's Carolyn. I was wondering if you could address arrested development. I have an idea about it, but I was wondering if you could put a particular astrological.
Yeah, it's right here in my defenses. It's retreat to earlier psychological stages. It's regression.
And staying there.
And so, well, yeah, if something splits off, if you're, you know, so like you have a wounded, you know, it's inner child work is also another way of looking at it, but you have a split off 2-year-old, and then that 2-year-old, like, okay, you know, we could think of some probably current political figures that might, you know, be an example of, I mean, how many people are like, he's like an infant, he's like a baby, right? That's precisely that, right? That's an unhealed, you know, at a certain stage and stuck there. And again, it comes out. You can't repress it that long because on to my next slide. And I know, how much time do we don't have a lot of time, right?
Well, thank you. That was what I was looking for.
Right. Linda, I only have until when?
15 minutes left.
Okay. So let me be quick here. So these are key points of complexes, just to quickly go over them. You know, as Jung said, complexes are autonomous. They are beyond ego control. They're beyond conscious control. They have a life of their own. They are, like I said, inner characters. They can arise or they can roar from, I mean, it's another way of thinking, arise is too gentle. They can roar from the unconscious into the conscious mind, flood the conscious mind with very strong affect. You know, this is when people have panic attacks, and I had panic attacks. So I know that I healed in regression therapy, but they can completely take over the consciousness, but they will also, oftentimes after the affect is discharged, they dissipate. In other words, they recede back into the unconscious. And back to whoever just asked me the question, complexes constantly seek to be expressed. Even though they're repressed, they're constantly seeking expression. They're knocking on the door of the consciousness all the time, in other words, you know, but that they mostly puncture them. If you have a healthy ego, they don't puncture the membrane, unlike the guy that I met in the park, you know, a couple hours ago, where clearly he has, you know, he doesn't have a healthy current life ego state. So all of the content of the subconscious is just kind of rushing around. This is what you see in extreme psychological states. You're kind of looking directly, when you look into pathological psychological states, you're kind of directly looking into the subconscious. And again, back to my point, who wants to walk around like that, being that irrational? We don't want to, right? But these irrational parts of us are seeking expression, and they will, you know, they will come up. Like I said, you know, we have this language. I don't know what came over me. I was beside myself. Something took over me. I just lost it, right? This is what happens. I froze. I shut down. This is what happens when they arise. A complex is also, because they can cause a kind of splitting and a projection, which is a kind of black and white thinking. When you're in the grip of a complex, it is almost like your psyche quite frequently will feel because it's feeling the initial trauma, will be in a kind of fight or flight mode, which makes you in survival mode, which narrows your consciousness, which makes you very black and white thinking, right? It's do or die to the psyche at that moment, again, depending on the kind of complex that's arising. But if it's one that was constellated in any way where your life was in danger, or you thought your life is in danger, these kinds of things are going to happen, and then you're going to split because the psyche can't deal with it and project it onto somebody else. But in a simpler way, it's like if you're unaware of your judgment complex, right, you're going to kind of be looking at everybody else like, oh, he's so judgmental, right? Because you're split off from it. You've split it from yourself, but it's a kind of black and white thinking. And like I said, another key point of complexes is to look at when we overdo something or we underdo something. It's not just a healthy expression of the energy. This is true in astrological archetypes. Like I said, there's the highest of the high and the lowest of the low. So another way of saying that is there's an empowered level of the archetype and there's a wounded level of the archetype, be it planetary or signs. Complexes are repetitive in nature because they're rooted in traumatic experience. Again, present and past life. Because they are rooted in traumatic experience, they often have a compulsion to them. And again, repetition that's what Freud talked about, repetition compulsion, that once a trauma is experienced, the psyche goes into this kind of the record stuck, and it just continues to repeat the trauma. Again, I've given other talks about that, but this is what our karma is. Our karma is a repetition of previous traumas. The majority of our karma is. a repetition compulsion. So it has this, because there's a gravity to it, it has this compulsive nature. Complexes, and Jung talked about this, they are absolutely resistant to change because you can't cognate your way out of them. Jung said they cannot be argued out of existence. And this is where, again, back to that, why a talk therapy might not necessarily dissolve or resolve a complex. You might be able to get a grip with it. You might be able to handle, something, adjust, whatever, deal with this, whatever this wound is. But to resolve it, again, the strategies are, you kind of have to really go into it. A complex, slightly different than what we might call a psychological issue, and that has to do with the psychological gravity of it. I forgot to mention this painting I have up here is by an artist called Amanda Wagner. It's called Beside Myself, which is also, a way of picturing that there's this other autonomous you living within you. And this, can be personification of complexes. Complexes are easily triggered by like circumstances. In other words, you had a, let's say back to my girl who was the second grader chasing the boy, and then she, any other circumstance that's even a hair like shaming will trigger all of that original repressed pain, and it'll kind of rush to the surface. So, and because trauma repeats itself, it happens over and over and over and over. Again, sometimes it's not the same circumstance, but it's a like circumstance, because part of our memory, or one of the functions of memory, is associative memory. So, a like circumstance triggers a whole, what I always call, it's like your folder or your file that holds all of those like memories in there, and all of the affect associated with them or constellated within them. And speaking of affect, this is my next point. All complexes have strong affect. They're highly charged, and it has physical, emotional, and mental components, right? So, you have like back to the shame, humiliation, there's strong emotional affect. It can be, there'll be a physical component. Maybe, we've all felt it before. The face flushes, the palms get sweaty, your heart beats, your knees get weak. And then there's some deep thoughts like, I'm worthless. That kind of cements it in place in a way that's a little bit of a structure of the complex. So those are the key points. I did have some slides here just to kind of talk a little bit about a few planetary complexes, but I don't know how much time I have. When am I going to, Linda?
Well, rather than say that, because I don't know your time where you are now, it'll be 8 minutes left.
All right. So do we want to take, anybody have any questions, or you want me to maybe just use this one slide example? All right, I'll just go on here. So for example, if we want to think of a solar complex, right, or the kinds of complexes we might associate with the principle of the sun. So in essence, again, thinking from what is the pure expression, the unfettered, highest, purest expression of the sun and what it represents within our consciousness. It's the principle of being. It's the principle of shining, right? It's like the self-gravity around which all the elements of our personality are organized. So like in the macrocosmic sense, we might say that the sun is the principle of consciousness itself that vitalizes all of life. And we know that from the physical aspect of the sun's light and how life-giving it is. So that's the positive expression. That's the pure expression of the archetype. And then the wounds happen. And the wounds cause all of these other different distorted expressions, which we can then start to kind of go, oh, those are complexes, right? So think about it again, that here's the sun, this, generous, shining, life-giving principle. And also in science, we have a thing called the black hole, when the sun collapses in on itself, right? That's narcissism. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Right? Then the black hole sucks in everything else around it, and it becomes a destructive, we don't know where black holes lead to. But in the psychology, when the principle of oneself is collapsed into itself, the gravity of self becomes so strong, we could call that narcissism, right? So then we would say somebody has a narcissistic complex. I mean, narcissism also relates a lot to the Aries Mars archetypes, in that it's about identity. And Alexander Lowen, gave a description of the pure form of narcissism as the loss of the true self. And that's very, it's solar, but it's also very Mars, because Mars we often associate with identity, or the search for identity. So narcissistic complex. We can get complexes. I wrote about this in my book, The Solar Inner Child. I consider this part of ourself that needs to be nurtured to be able to creatively express ourselves. And then we get all kinds of wounds around that, right? When we're growing up, this is what I associate this with, say, just as you're coming into school age and you go to class and you go to do creative things, right? That's what I associate our solar inner child as, somewhere around this, 5-6-year-old who paints things and comes home with little stars on their paper. And, maybe you get criticized then, maybe you don't get, so then a complex forms. So some kind of solar complex can form about being oneself, or being noticed or not being noticed. We get insecurity complexes associated with the sun and Leo, where somebody, again, either overdoing or underdoing, they may be hiding because of wounds, or they're overcompensating. So then there's some kind of maybe grandiosity or self-aggrandizing involved. We can get complexes around our creativity, our giftedness. Like I said, back to this solar inner child, when we have gone to creatively express ourselves and that's been wounded, then then something around our creativity or our giftedness forms a complex. And then in another way, and back to my original example, or the example that I shared with you, Mars, right? She had a Leo North node, but the nodes were squared. Mars, it's the wounds around the giving and receiving of love and the natural expression of joy. And so we can clearly form lots of complexes around that. So this is just an example of some complexes, or things that can form, how complexes can form around the natural function of a particular archetype. So I just want to jump ahead. I did have some other planets, but we don't have time. I just want to jump ahead because this answers Linda's question, and this was what Jung was talking about resolving complexes. And he was saying that, as we know, a complex can be really overcome only if it's lived out to the full. In other words, if we're to develop further, we have to draw to us and drink down to the very dregs what, because of our complexes, we've held at a distance. So in other words, everything that's been repressed, the painfulness has to be re-entered. Again, the defenses move through the going into the pain. It's true, a complex can only be healed once the emotional content is discharged and assimilated emotionally. This is something Y in EA, Jeffrey has always said, that the soul evolves, or evolution of the soul happens through the emotional body. Right? Because these things don't disappear. This is what I wrote my book on, karmic complexes. These complexes don't go away in the afterlife or in between lives. You bring them life to life with you. Again, they're called karma. And so one needs to go into this deep emotional content that can resurface in one's current life, discharge it, bring it to completion, and assimilate it emotionally. And that's what I mean by when I say either you run your complexes or they run you.
Wow, Patricia, that was just amazing. I just wish your meeting was longer
Yeah.
because I'm sure we've all got lots of questions. But anyway, it was fantastic. So we've
Okay.
a few minutes left. I've
See if there's any questions.
yeah, go ahead, anyone.
I have a question.
Yes.
Going back, way back, you had mentioned when you were associating astrological archetypes to some of the different reactions to complexes,
Mm-hmm.
that Libra was associated with splitting and fragmentation. I thought that was interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I did write about that in my Karmic Complexes book. Libra as an archetype, now I would say all the air signs have that to a certain degree, and fragmentation is actually more Uranian, but the splitting is very Libran because as in evolutionary astrology, you know, we say that the archetype is not inherently balanced, it's seeking balance, and it goes to extremes, right? So how does one contain extremes within one's own psyche? It's often not easy, and that's exactly, so the psyche protects itself then by splitting, and that's what I was saying, that then becomes black and white thinking, that then think Libra, again, me and the other, right? And I project that onto the other. So that dynamic of splitting and then projecting is very much within the Libran domain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks.
I mean, I'm not saying everybody that has, I mean, so many, I have said this about the Pluto Libra generation, so many of them that have come into, you know, therapy with me quite often start out their conversations with, I'm aware of my saint and my sinner, I'm aware of my victim and my murderer. You know, they're aware of the extremes within them. It's just not everybody can hold that together, right? And when you can't hold that kind of extremity, a splitting will happen.
Patricia, are retrograde planets indicate deeper trauma?
No, I can't say I've ever made that association. I mean, certainly in pure EA thinking, the retrograde planets are individuating functions. They're Uranian functions. So a planet that retrogrades certainly internalizes to a certain degree, but the intentionality behind that kind of retrograde is a kind of to do it your own way. You know, like a Mercury retrograde is not meant to be like thinking with the consensus. So, yeah, I have not made that association. Pluto retrograde maybe, because the whole soul, the whole consciousness is then turned in on itself because it wants to get to its core motives and its core desires. So it certainly would be a very deeply introspective consciousness when Pluto retrogrades.
Does Pluto rule complexes?
Well, I mean, you know, I think it's more complex than that. I don't know. I mean, Pluto rules wounds to the soul, and wounds to the soul are at the core of complexes. But I think it might be a little more complex than that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, guys, 2 more questions. Who'd like to go ahead?
When you see something, Patricia, I admire your work so much. It's Tashi. You see something like a Pluto-Uranus conjunction in a chart that's heavily constellated with like Sun, Moon, Venus, Mars, things like that. What do you think of the collective unconscious work that the soul's up to?
Again, it depends on the level of consciousness of the person, because the manifestation, I mean, I'm a Pluto-Uranus generation. So I think it can manifest in a lot of different ways. I think some people can become fragmented and overcome by that. Some people can internalize it and make it all their own without the proper discernment. I don't know if I'm answering your question or if I understand what you wanted to touch on about the collective component.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the collective component always, but that answers it. Thanks.
Yeah, well, those archetypes are certainly associated with transpersonal collective, but they have personal connotation as well. So I wouldn't say that, if you look at somebody who's in the Pluto-Uranus generation and say, they're highly attuned to the collective consciousness, they may or may not be, based on their own level of evolution.
Okay, last question.
I mean, it can also correlate with insanity, which is somebody who may be subsumed by the collective, right, or subsumed within the collective, without their own identity, taken over by. Sorry, next question.
Where can you buy your book?
Amazon.
Amazon?
Mm-hmm. Last I saw it was on Amazon.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's published by the Wessex Astrologer, which is in London or in England. So you could also look them up, but I think it's on most online booksellers still.
That question that the previous lady asked about the Pluto-Uranus conjunction, I have one of those. And I think it depends on the house that it's in. Because mine's definitely in the collective area, so I'm very, very attuned to the collective, the world, global aspect. But I know a few others that have the same conjunction. They're clueless. It's all about them.
Well, yeah, and then there's the inherent level of evolution or consciousness, but then there's also sub-generations within that generation. I'm one of them because I have Jupiter Chiron opposed in the 12th house. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm highly attuned to the collective. I mean, I'm aware of it. I have to say I wasn't always aware of it. And that was a cause of difficulty sometimes, picking up things or being influenced by things that were beyond, the scope of my own need to be tuned into. So yeah, then there's also sub-generations within generations and other aspects that might really drive it. Mine is on the 6-12th axis and then has Chiron Jupiter over here in opposition.
Yeah, mine's right in the 11th house.
Yeah, so that would be, yeah, and with a person of consciousness, like most likely you are, because you're on this webinar, then you certainly would probably have some of those. Uranus is also associated with long-term memory, past life memory specifically.
So Patricia, I have one last question for you from my friend Ray. Ray, go ahead.
Would these concepts apply to all life forms apart from human?
Well, we don't know the inner life of animals. We do know anybody who's ever had them, been with them, knows and has some consciousness to be aware of that they certainly do have a rich inner life and emotional life. But I don't know if animals form psychological complexes. But, I can say, there's different theories about how trauma impacts an animal's psyche. In some theories, they would say that they have a more natural reaction to it and that they're able to overcome trauma. But I think in my own observations, if you see a dog that's, been abused, how it carries forward that trauma. So to a certain degree, would you say that dog has developed a complex? I mean, the dynamics of trauma are probably the same for that being, for that consciousness. Has it developed a complex? It might, because, there's some dogs, people have rescue dogs, and they're like, I don't know why, but guys that wear red jackets, he hates them. Loves everybody else, but if a guy shows up in a red jacket or a uniform or something, so, we could say he has a complex about that, and probably for a good reason.
Thank you for this. I tell you what, I enjoy it immensely, and one of these years you might read my thesis about all life.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. Patricia, thank you so much from all of us. This has been absolutely fantastic. Mm-hmm. Please thank Patricia Walsh, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
No rush.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
But you're hungry.
Okay, thanks.
I'm glad to have this on recording so I can go back and watch it again and again.
Thank you.
I'll have to do part 2 because I didn't get through all of my slides.
Yes, please do.
Okay.
slot in a couple of weeks. Would you like that one, Patricia?
I'm sorry, too many people talking.
Available slot in a couple of
I'm glad
weeks.
that you were able to eat that chocolate drink and that it didn't come back up.
I think people are having conversations with other
Okay.
people.
All right.
Thanks again. Bye, everybody.
Bye.